Okay, take two. For those of you who do not know me, my name is Tal Howard, and I teach here in Christ College, Valparaiso's Honors College, and I also hold what's called the Duesenberg Chair in Christian Ethics. And it's my great privilege and honor today to have a conversation with my colleague and dear friend, Nicholas Denysenko, on his new book, which you see on the screen, and there's some promotional material in the back as well. Our plan today, we're going to run up probably a little over an hour, and I'm going to first introduce the book and the author and start a conversation that will last, 30 minutes or a little more. But then there'll be time for your questions, and whether those who are here live or also those who are participating via webinar that Nick will recognize, and so think of what questions you have as we go along. First of all, I should also say the book is hot off the press, just really a few weeks old here. We're honored to have Michael Thompson, the publisher from Cascade, imprint of Whip and Stock Publishers. I thought that really the best way to introduce a book is to read the cover description. So I'll start with that. The Church's Unholy War, Russia's Invasion of Ukraine and Orthodoxy, of course, is the title. And the description is, how did religion contribute to Russia's invasion of Ukraine? Heated disputes and alienation among Orthodox Christians in Ukraine and Russia contributed to Russian aggression in Crimea and Donbass in 2014, and the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. And I'm sure many of you have followed this with great grief in the news these many months now, years. This book examines attempts from the early 20th century to the present day to liberate the Ukrainian Orthodox Church from Russian control. It explores the causes of bitter alienation, Russia's use of soft power to maintain control, the development of hate speech used to discriminate against independent-minded Ukrainians, and the transition from soft to hard power from 2014 to the present, and especially going back to the most recent episode began in February of 2022. To read a couple of the book's endorsements, this one's from Catherine Warner of Penn State University, and she has this to say about the book. This book is a tour de force analysis of the struggle to establish an independent Orthodox Church of Ukraine, over time, written by one of the foremost experts on Orthodoxy, Nicholas Denysenko. With sophistication and vision, the author systematically lays out the historical roots and future prospects for intra-Orthodox conflict, not just between Ukraine and Russia, but also in global Orthodoxy more broadly. This book is a must-read for anyone interested in Eastern Christianity. And this from Jose Casanova, Emeritus Professor of Sociology at Georgetown University, and many people would recognize him as one of the leading religious sociologists of religion, global religiosity in the world. Quote, this book is the definitive account to understand the religious dimension of the war on Ukraine and the divisions within global orthodoxy. Balanced, clear, and authoritative. And now to introduce the distinguished author. Nicholas Denysenko is Emil and Elfriede Jochum Professor and Chair and Professor of Theology here at Valparaiso University. He received his undergraduate degree from the University of Minnesota, and he holds MDiv, Master of Divinity, from St. Vladimir's Orthodox Theological Seminary, and a PhD from the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. Prior to coming to Valpo, he taught for 7 years at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles, where he also directed the Huffington Ecumenical Institute. He's published numerous books, articles, and essays on liturgical theology and religion in Ukraine, including Liturgical Reform After Vatican II, The Impact on Orthodoxy, published by Fortress Press in 2015, The Orthodox Church in Ukraine, A Century of Separation, Northern Illinois University Press, 2018, and his two most recent books have been published with Cascade. So he doesn't have just one book out, but he has two books out, written quite closely to one another. So the one we're not talking about today is this is the day that the Lord has made, the liturgical year in Orthodoxy. And I can highly recommend that one if you're interested in Orthodox Church and its worship and its sort of holy calendar. That's the one to read. But the one we're talking about today, again, is the Church's Unholy War, Russia's invasion of Ukraine and Orthodoxy. Professor Denysenko is also an ordained deacon in the Orthodox Church in America. And not least, I should say, as a friend, I know he's a rabid Minnesota Vikings fan. And as a father of a teenage daughter, he probably can tell you more about Taylor Swift than anyone in this room. So he's a man of many skills. Nick, I thought we would just start on a personal note. You have a very close connection to Ukraine. Maybe you could tell the audience here and on the webinar just a little bit about your own heritage, and maybe is there a backstory to this book of why did you want to write it and why now?
First of all, thanks, Tal, for the introduction, for moderating the discussion. Thanks to all of you for coming today. And for those who are online, I can't see you, but I believe that you're there. Yes, so all four of my grandparents were born and raised in Ukraine during the Soviet era. And they came to the United States following World War II as part of the larger group of immigrants that went to various parts of the world following the Yalta Conference in 1945. All four ended up here. Actually, they ended up, all of them, in Chicago. And my grandfather on my mother's side was a priest of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. He was ordained a deacon and then a priest in displaced person camps, first a deacon in 1948, and then a priest in 1952. So I was raised in an emigre community while everyone else was watching cartoons on Saturday morning. My brother and I were going to Ukrainian school as part of my grandfather's Ukrainian Orthodox parish. And as often happens in diaspora communities, it was on the one hand that difficult navigation of who are you? Are you Ukrainian? Are you American? Are you both? How do you blend the two? How do you explain to people that your Easter is different? And that, at least when we were growing up, our Christmas was different. Recently, the Orthodox in Ukraine, at least some of them, have finally moved from January 7th to December 25th, which didn't make the book. But it's kind of an interesting side topic. But I would have to ask to get out of school on January 7th to go Christmas caroling and to go to the Divine Liturgy because they followed what was known as a Julian calendar. In terms of what inspired me to write the book was just to know the experience, the immigrant experience as a first-generation American. To be in my grandfather's office and to be in the midst of his dusty collection of periodicals that circulated among Orthodox immigrants that told the story of who they were. And that to me is ultimately the point, is who gets to tell the story of what's happening in Ukraine, why it's happening, what the motivations are for a stalwart defense, what the motivations are to have an Orthodox church with a distinctly Ukrainian identity that is distinct from the Russian Orthodox Church. Who gets to tell that story? And that is probably the most important issue for me, both personally and professionally these days, is the question of authorship and the question of what is the meta narrative? What is the story that shapes and forms people? And who gets to take control of that meta narrative? And the reason that it's important is that in Ukrainian history, and this is true of many cultures and peoples, nations and tribes throughout the world, is that the imperial colonial occupier of Ukraine, at one time it was Poland, and for on and off for the last 300 plus years, it's been Russia or Soviet Union, and then in this sort of post-Soviet tense environment of who is going to be the power in the East, Russia has been attempting to be the author of the meta-narrative, both of what Ukraine's place is in Europe and in Eurasia, but also in terms of what Orthodox Ukrainians, and just to quickly note here, Ukrainians self-identify, 60% of Ukrainian citizens self-identify as Orthodox. So that's a big chunk of their population. It's a solid majority, and they, for a long time, constituted a very large minority within the Russian Orthodox Church. And so part of what I'm trying to do is to tell the story of how religion became one of the many issues of contention, of tension, and ultimately one of the catalysts that has both contributed to divisions among Ukrainians, between Ukrainians and Russians, and also, in a certain sense, has been weaponized by the Russian Federation and also the Russian Orthodox Church.
Yeah, in reading the book, I'm struck by just how much history you have to master. It's I mean, it's in some ways the book focuses on the contemporary situation, but I'm trained in history too here, so this is a plug for studying history. To understand the present, you have to know the past, so how the present became the present. But you know, and you focus quite a bit on the 20th century. But even prior to that, this conflict has some very deep-seated issues about interpretation of the long-term past, about just orthodoxy in this part of the world, and you know how it came. Maybe I know that's a maybe too big of a question, but what do you hope the reader takes away from, especially I think of chapter 1, when you talk about some of the older history?
I'm going to answer that question in two parts. One part that I didn't focus exclusively on in the book, and just for some orientation for those of you for whom the topic of orthodoxy as a whole is new, is one can't think of orthodoxy as being like one big Roman Catholic Church where everyone is kind of under the Roman umbrella, and where when a bishop is elected, then you have to have the Pope or the Bishop of Rome confirm that election. There are 15 independent Orthodox churches that are essentially bound together by confessing the same faith and observing the same Byzantine style of worship. More or less, they follow the same calendar, but there's also a fierce independence that Orthodox churches adhere to. Sometimes it's regional. So you can have an Orthodox church that's multinational, like the Church of Alexandria is a good example of that. It's essentially the Orthodox Church on the African continent. The Russian Orthodox Church is a multinational church. But ever since the decline of the Ottoman Empire, Orthodox churches have tended to be clustered within nations, within nation states. So as the Ottoman Empire declined, the Church of Greece, the Church of Serbia, the Church of Albania, there's even an independent Orthodox church in Poland, which is quite small, but it was one of those churches that emerged as an important institution for a large Orthodox minority within Poland in 1924. And the reason that this is important is because it happens in the modern period where Orthodoxy tends to become more associated with nationality. And Ukraine tried to follow that path. As soon as it became clear that the Russian Empire was going to collapse, and there were questions beginning to circulate on what was going to replace the Russian Empire. It certainly wasn't, there were talks about a larger federation of peoples where Russia would be the center, but they might have autonomous republics within it, or there could be independent nation states. As soon as it became clear there were Ukrainian politicians, historians, intellectuals, artists, and church leaders who wanted to establish both an independent nation state, which we see following the French Revolution, and also to establish an independent Orthodox Church. And the reason that this is important is there are 15 of these independent Orthodox churches. They interact with one another in terms of their common confession of faith, but they maintain their independence. And in the 20th century, going into the early part of the 21st century, Ukraine struggled to obtain this officially independent status of having their own Orthodox Church, which would be a formidable religious community in Ukraine because of the 60%, because it is the majority of the Ukrainian population. Because back in the 17th century, the Russian Orthodox Church essentially assumed control of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church on the basis of a historical debate that I'm not going to get into, at least today. I touch upon it in the book, but essentially what happened was that the leader of the Orthodox in the world, who cannot be considered to be something like a pope, to be clear, but is sort of like, I would like to think of the ecumenical patriarch of Constantinople as being kind of like a chairman of the board. I'm sure the ecumenical patriarchate would object to this description. And there's a much larger debate that circulates around that topic. But they have been the ones who have started the process of establishing these new independent churches ever since the gradual decline of the Ottoman Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Russian Empire. And so they were the ones to whom Ukrainians who wanted to have their own church looked to, but they were the ones who originally, back at the end of the 17th century, asked the Russian Orthodox Church to ordain the leader of the Orthodox Church in Ukraine. And so essentially the debate is one of semantics. The ecumenical patriarchate says, we only asked you to ordain their leader, that's it. Whereas the Russians say, no, you gave us complete jurisdiction over this church. And my opinion is that if you look at the actual documents, that they don't agree with one another. Some of the documents support one claim, some of them support the other. But ultimately, it doesn't really matter. What matters is that through the course of history, there are these episodes where when Ukrainian intellectuals, as part of this rather painful process of establishing independent nation states, begin to assert themselves through rather ordinary, customary mechanisms, literature, education, language. The officials of the Russian Empire in the 19th century attempt to snuff that out. They hear about groups that are gathering, and of course, they're very well aware of what's happening in the Ottoman Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and they're trying to preserve, along with the British Empire, control. And so they try to snuff out these intellectual groups, and intellectuals who in particular are pushing for Ukrainian identity. And in the book, I mentioned one of those intellectuals, very well known to Ukrainians, the poet Taras Shevchenko, who is famous for dreaming of Washington, George Washington, a Ukrainian version of George Washington, to establish, to get rid of the colonizers and establish an independent nation state. And this becomes affixed to the historical memory of Ukrainians who then want to establish their own independent nation state. And in the course of absolutely brutal period of civil wars that goes over the period of about 3 to 4 years, from 1917 to 1920, what eventually happens is that part of Ukraine, a small part of it, is in Poland, and the larger part of it is part of the Soviet Union. And it's a delayed process of actually establishing national sovereignty and territorial integrity that is not finalized until 1991. But here's the kicker, and this is why studying history is so important. Even when it's established, it is contested. All of the historical literature that is out now about how Ukraine and Russia and the fall of the Soviet Union occurred. And here I would recommend the work of Sergei Plokhy, who is a professor of history at Harvard University, who has written prodigiously on this particular topic. And he has a new book out on the Russo-Ukrainian War, which touches upon all of these issues, shows very clearly that exactly where Ukraine's borders would fall in 1991 were contested for a period of up to 3 to 4 years. And the Ukrainians are turning to whom? To Washington to help to protect them, and also to the United Kingdom to ensure that their territorial integrity would not be violated. The church becomes a very important community, or to be a little bit colder about it, organization, because the Russian Orthodox Church has essentially controlled the Orthodox in Ukraine up until 1989. And that's why this is so important. And all of these processes, mechanisms, negotiations that are happening on a geopolitical scale, no matter how much a person wants to wave the flag or the banner saying separation of church and state, separation of church and state, it doesn't fly. It doesn't fly. The church is always caught up in those winds and has to find its place in negotiating exactly how all of that is going to pan out. And so I touch upon that in the book to kind of establish how these conflicts became escalated at the end of the Soviet period and the beginning of the period of independent Ukraine, and how that escalation lingers, evolves, becomes ever more bitter, and ultimately leads to the religious question, which is certainly not the only issue, but the religious question contributing to a transformation from soft power to actual aggression and violence.
You were beginning to sketch a little bit about just the organization of Orthodoxy and 15 different churches. But in reading the book, I'm struck by how messy this situation is today within Ukraine. There's sort of an alphabet soup of abbreviations one has to know the internecine divisions within Orthodoxy, even within Ukraine. Maybe could you, in somewhat simplified form, flesh that out a little bit for us?
So to try to flesh out that which is constantly confounding is a difficult task. I'll do my best. Here's the simple version. Okay, 60% of the population is Orthodox. A large minority of Ukrainians are Greek Catholic, so they're in communion with the Roman Catholic Church, but they essentially follow the Byzantine Orthodox ritual practice. Very similar in terms of practice, of very vibrant intellectual life. The simplest way to describe this is that the movement for independence, and the technical word for that in Orthodox vocabulary is autocephaly. It simply means self-headed or self-governing, began in 1917. And it meant resistance, honestly, because the Russian Orthodox Church, which had just gone through its own period of very important reform during what's known as the Moscow Council, on which was abbreviated and actually shortened because of the Civil War and the Revolution, on its own a very important historical event. And there were debates occurring both in Moscow and in Kyiv during the course of the war, when the Bolsheviks are actively persecuting the church and eliminating intellectuals who pose an ideological threat to Marxist-Leninism or Leninist Marxism, however that acronym actually works itself out. A small group of Ukrainians successfully creates an independent church, but the method that they use is subversive, it's revolutionary, and no one in Orthodoxy says that that's okay. So they sort of exist. And at the same time, you have in Poland this small group of Ukrainians who are like, well, we're not going to do it that way, but we're paying attention, right? Okay, so 1939, Stalin and Hitler betray Poland, right? And for a very short period of time, this portion of West Ukraine that was under Poland is now in the Soviet Union. And these people who had enjoyed relative freedom with some tension with the majority Roman Catholics in West Ukraine are saying, oh my goodness. So this is what Bolshevik religious persecution looks like. It's fierce, it's overbearing. And then the Germans invade. And of course, the Germans, at least initially, want to appease the Orthodox in Ukraine. So they're somewhat tolerant. And the Ukrainians initially think, hey, we're going to have a chance at establishing our own nation state. And so they try to unify the churches, and it becomes this hot mess because at the same time, Stalin says, oh my goodness, Hitler has betrayed me. We're in all-out war, and we need to find a way to rally the troops. One way to do that was to revive the Orthodox Church. So Stalin makes an agreement with the Orthodox bishops in Soviet Ukraine, certainly on Soviet Russian territory. And the Ukrainians in Ukraine are trying to figure out how what is going to come out of all of this. And when the war ends, what happens is that the Russian Orthodox Church doubles down on its control over Ukraine. This Yalta conference that I mentioned annexes West Ukraine to the Soviet Union, and Stalin forces these Greek Catholic Ukrainians to become Orthodox, to become Russian Orthodox. And so everyone's under one umbrella. And what they do then is, in one of these methods that I kind of usually use the term soft power, they appoint a native Ukrainian. His name is, in 1966, his name is Filaret Denysenko, no relation, at least I don't think so. I usually say no relation because he's got a very bad reputation. So I'm going to say no relation for the time being, though I honestly don't know. They appoint a native Ukrainian to kind of appease the natives, to keep them under control, because he speaks their language. He knows them. You know, he knows how to control them, at least presumably. But what happens ultimately at the end of the Soviet period, when Gorbachev is trying to hang on to the Soviet Union, is he unleashes this policy of openness. And in the openness, he allows the independent movements to return to the Soviet Union. And when that happens, they return in force. And instead of having everything neatly tucked under one Russian Orthodox Church, as of 1989, West Ukraine, especially the area or the region of Galicia, which is, in terms of concentration, is the most religious place in Ukraine. Anyone will tell you that. They have the most Greek Catholics. They have the highest concentration of Orthodox, and no matter what the Orthodox belong to, most of their people either return to the Greek Catholic Church or opt for this autocephalous church that has returned to Ukraine. And then you still have the Russian Orthodox Church trying to figure out, what are we going to do about all this? So for 2 years, the Russian Church in Ukraine resists the autocephalous movement and appeals to everyone who will listen that they're stealing our parishes from us. And then in 1991, the process started a month before Ukraine declared independence, but it was 3 months after they declared independence, this Filaret, who essentially had espoused Russian nationalism, this whole notion of Russians, Belarusians, and Ukrainians being one people, was not invented in the 2000s. It has roots much longer before. He says, guess what? We want to have our own independent church. We want autocephaly too. And so a huge episode of religious chaos ensues. And what happens is that from 1992 until 2019, there is one large minority Greek Catholic church, which is in Galicia, and has developed a formidable intellectual life, establishing their own university largely on the donations of Ukrainians who live outside of Ukraine, in Lviv. And then you have 3 Orthodox churches. One autocephalous Orthodox church, also in Galicia, highly concentrated there. A new church headed by Filaret, who in his controversy is kicked out of the Russian Orthodox Church, and not only kicked out, but anathematized. Just imagine the worst possible punishment that you can give to someone. That's what the Russian Orthodox Church gave to Filaret in the year 1997. They anathematized him, which is to curse him. It's worse than excommunication. There's actually a ritual that is used on the first Sunday of Lent where the deacon in a very large basso profundo voice invokes the names of all of those who are anathematized with great drama. Apparently one year in the cathedral in Los Angeles, my friend Professor Sean Griffin from Notre Dame might be able to relate to this. When they were invoking the names of those who were anathematized, there was an earthquake, or so the story goes. To add a little bit of drama, so it's a bad thing to be anathematized. So he starts this renegade Kiev patriarchate. They're outside of Orthodoxy. And then you have a Ukrainian Orthodox Church that is under Moscow. And they kind of have this uneasy status quo for a period of about 26 years until 2018, when President Poroshenko reaches a deal with the ecumenical patriarch of Constantinople to try to unite all of the Orthodox into one church. The whole purpose of the deal, at least from the political standpoint, was to remove Russian influence from the church. And I would say that from a political perspective, it was somewhat successful. It was successful in terms of they established a church that some Orthodox, not all, believe is legitimate and now recognize. And they took a lot of people out of that Russian influence and established a new church called the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. But it was not successful because Poroshenko was hoping to use that victory and ride it to re-election. And he was really resoundingly defeated in the election later in 2019 by the current president, Volodymyr Zelensky. So that achievement was not nearly enough for him to overcome the obstacles to maintaining power in Ukraine. And these divisions between these churches continue to create problems both within Ukraine and also in the Orthodox world outside of Ukraine, because some of the churches support this new Orthodox Church of Ukraine, but there are also many Orthodox churches that don't support it. And when Russia invaded Ukraine, that only made it more complicated because the church that was a part of the Russian Orthodox Church was caught in the middle in the crossfire. And they are now claim that they're independent, but the Ukrainian government and a lot of the Ukrainian people don't believe that they're independent of Russia. And it's creating enormous problems that have caught the attention of the United Nations Council on Human Rights and the World Council of Churches. So it's not a small issue. It is a big enough issue that conflict between the Ukrainian government and the church that had been under Moscow is now being weaponized by all of the parties.
Let's see, I'm going to use moderator's privilege just to make a brief aside. And what I appreciate about this book is the historical complexity. And I know for many of you, it might be hard to follow all of this, but I think, and I think Nick would probably agree with me, what many countries face in their politics, and certainly we do in the United States, is just very simplified views of history that sort of say it's clearly this way and this clearly what should be done. This book really takes a scholar's finesse and say it's really, history has many different sides and it's quite complicated. So in light of that, I thought maybe to manage some of the complexity, we've talked about some of the historical detail. Maybe I could just ask you briefly there 4 concepts that I thought were kind of key. If you could maybe define them relatively briefly, but maybe spend a little more time on the last one I'm going to mention. One is just a word you've already mentioned several times, nationalism. I do define that. Another is, and these are kind of related concepts, Ukrainianization, Russification, and then this word that it's in Russian appears in the news from time to time, Ruski mir. Could you define those for us?
Yes. With nationalism, I want to define it in the Ukrainian context, especially in the church context. Nationalism becomes problematic when there's a line that's blurred between patriotism, like a healthy patriotism where one is exercising, if there is such a thing, I don't know. I'm not an expert. We have an expert in the hall who could probably speak more clearly on these issues. yes, I'm looking at you, Slava. But the line being blurred between patriotism and nationalism in Ukraine becomes problematic where Ukraine is both a multi-cultural, multi-ethnic, and a multi-religious country. Just to illustrate the example, one of the grievances that was aired during this time when they created this Orthodox Church of Ukraine, that was it was voiced by three prominent Russian politicians: Dmitry Peskov, Sergei Lavrov, and President Putin himself. And that was that Russian speakers would certainly be persecuted and would have their rights taken away from them in pretty much throughout all of Ukraine, because the official language of Ukraine is Ukrainian. It's a best known joke in Ukraine is that there's no such thing as a Ukrainian who doesn't speak fluent Russian. In terms of what the lingua franca is in Ukraine, it kind of depends on where you are. In certain places of Ukraine, even in places that are certainly distinctly Ukrainian, like Kharkiv, an intellectual hub in Eastern Ukraine, it was typical until the Russian invasion to speak Russian. And so this kind of identity of Ukrainian only, Ukrainian always, even to the point of making memory of certain Ukrainian patriots whose history is spurious or dubious in a certain sense. An example of this would be Stepan Bandera, a figure who was one of the leaders of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, who in his origins organized and carried out assassinations to establish Ukrainian sovereignty during the period of Poland, and then ended up leading fighters far beyond the end of World War II. I mentioned Bandera for two reasons. One, because his name is the one that's usually associated with Ukrainian nationalism and is associated with West Ukraine in particular. And two, because you have streets that are named in his honor, statues that are erected in his honor, certainly not the only Ukrainian hero by any means. His name has become an epithet. It started at the Revolution of Dignity on the Maidan in 2013 to 14, and to this day, where Russians essentially say that neo-Nazis and banderovtsi, people who are Banderites, who follow this line of thinking, this kind of nationalism of Ukrainian only. And by the way, certainly Russians are not the only minorities in Ukraine. You go into Southwest Ukraine, Romanians are a very important ethnic minority. There are other Moldovans, other ethnic minorities throughout Ukraine, to the point that the churches have to have appoint clergy who can celebrate the liturgy in other languages in those regions of Ukraine. So that kind of nationalism can be a problem on the Ukrainian side. And this is not, I'm not trying to make a blanket statement saying that all Ukrainians are like that. This is the accusation that is leveled against Ukraine that justified the invasion, at least in part. On the other hand, there is a circulation of Russian nationalism, not only within Russia, but also in Ukraine. And that's where all of these phenomena that Tal just mentioned kind of come to a head. Ukrainization was a process of what we would consider normal construction of the nation state, where you construct a meta-narrative that tells the story of who you are, and you affix it to your public education curriculum. And so who do you read? Who are the poets that you read? Who writes the textbooks? What kind of perspective is represented in that textbook? Ukrainization was part of a process of making sure that Ukrainian was the language that was used in government, when anything was circulated and distributed. And what's really interesting about it is that Lenin supported Ukrainization because he did not want the Soviet Union to have any legacy of Russian nationalism. He wasn't the author of Ukrainization by any means, but he was one of the proponents of it because he wanted to show that the revolution in the Soviet Union would be the groundswell, the cell of the international revolution that was supposed to be inevitable, the end of history, if you will. So Ukrainization was a way of establishing that meta-narrative, of providing that sort of glue that would bind people together. And it was inaugurated in the early 1920s in Soviet Ukraine, and then it was stopped under Stalin because Stalin turned to more Russian nationalism, to centralization in Moscow as part of his policy to galvanize control over the Soviet Union, even though he himself was not an ethnic Russian. Ukrainization certainly was resumed when independent Ukraine was started in 1991 with some opposition. And the problem came into play where you have pockets of places in Ukrainian territory that are clearly Russian speaking, like the Donbas region, for example, or Crimea. And there's a whole bunch of literature on Crimea and how Crimea was kind of the sticking point when Ukraine declared independence and Ukrainian-Russian relations, and in terms of what the people who lived in Crimea actually wanted in terms of autonomy in other parts of Ukraine as well. So Ukrainization has also been an important part of the church, and here's why. Ukrainian Greek Catholics and Ukrainian Orthodox who didn't want to be governed by the Russian Orthodox Church wanted to use Ukrainian as the language in which they prayed. This sounds normal to us, but just think about how much Catholics struggled to even have languages other than Latin allowed. The official language of the Mass is still Latin. Everything else is a mere translation, as my students in liturgy have heard me say before. So in Ukraine, the introduction of Ukrainian to the liturgy itself was a bold move, and a move that most other Slavic Orthodox have not made. The Russian Orthodox Church, for example, prays in Church Slavonic with Russian pronunciation. And so Ukrainization has become an identity marker that distinguishes a certain kind of Ukrainian who is either Greek Catholic or Orthodox from another kind of Orthodox. And that has become part of the debate among Orthodox, both Ukrainian and Ukrainian and Russian. And now I want to turn to the Ruski Mir, and I'm going to try to keep this brief because this is also a difficult issue. There's actually a debate among Orthodox scholars today on what the Ruski Mir, it just means Russian world, and what it actually is. A number of people have published on it. I looked at it as an initiative, as an attempt to articulate what a civilization might look like that would be an alternative to Europeanization, to the values of the European Union that would be anchored in orthodoxy, but would clearly be centered in Moscow and in the Russian Orthodox Church. And the Ruski Mir as an initiative draws from a number of historical sources. You can't say that it's a linear evolution of historical train of thought that begins at point A and ends at point Z. It draws from here and there in an attempt to draw people into conservative type of orthodoxy that shares the values of so-called Holy Rus, which again is not the easiest thing to define what Holy Rus is. It kind of harkens back to these medieval principalities of nation states that were certainly related to one another, but did not constitute one nation. It would be very difficult to make that argument, and there's a lot of literature that dismisses it. And the Ruski Mir becomes important because when the patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church is elected and enthroned in the year 2009, he takes it upon himself to use this myth, this kind of collection of of historical claims, among which is that Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine are really one people. That's one of the most important parts of the historical claims that he makes. First, he uses it in speeches. Then the Russian Orthodox Church puts this idea into their enormous media machine and circulates it everywhere. Of course, in Russia, but definitely in Ukraine and Belarus, and in the United States and Canada too. And they circulate this idea of a Ruski Mir, or a Russian world, and Ukrainians resist it. And it becomes very problematic, first with the Maidan Revolution of Dignity and the beginning of Russian aggression in 2014, but most definitely with the Russian invasion in 2022, because a number of, first, Ukrainians object to the circulation of this idea as having been weaponized to justify the occupation and the invasion of Ukraine, to pollute and to mislead the people from the pulpit in the churches. It led to the point where Ukraine's secret service investigated parishes and clergy looking for literature to see if they could identify collaborators on the basis of possessing material that promoted this notion of the Russian world, or of the Ruski Mir. And in the Orthodox world, it's a contentious issue for two reasons. One is that some 100+ Orthodox theologians signed a declaration that claimed that the Ruski Mir is a heresy, that it promotes the heresy of kind of a rabid nationalism, which in Orthodox circles is known as ethnophilitism. It's basically the idea that one tribe is favored above all of the others. And the second reason that it's problematic is that over 400 priests of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church that was subordinate to Moscow and is kind of caught in the crossfire now, requested that the ecumenical patriarch and the other ancient patriarchates would convene a tribunal to hold Patriarch Kirill on trial for using the Ruski Mir idea as a weapon that justified Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the violence that ensued. So the Ruski Mir, the reason it's contentious is because there's a debate among scholars. Is this really a heresy, or is it a myth? Is it a myth that failed? And I imagine that that debate will extend the careers of several people who are working on this topic for decades to come.
See, I might have a few more questions, but I want to open it to the floor and online shortly. But you mentioned the Maidan Revolution of Dignity of 2014, and that in the book is a crucial moment. I wonder if you could elaborate on that. But then something else you said. So these are in some ways two very separate questions. You mentioned the Patriarch of Moscow, Kirill. Exactly who is he? Are there other personalities that are important for this conflict, religious personalities, and especially in understanding his view of the West? You know, some of it we see in the news, just a very negative view of the West, a view of the Nazification of Ukraine. Is that a complete fantasy build, image of the West? Where does that come from? So anyway, 2014, why is that important? And Patriarch Kirill and the view he has, not just of the Ruski Mir, but of the West as well, where that come from. And
that's a good question. Let me start with the Revolution of Dignity and the Maidan. The Maidan is a plaza. It's Independence Square in Kyiv. It's a very lovely place. Large statues of the Archangel Michael preside. He's the patron saint of Kyiv and preside over the Maidan. The Revolution of Dignity actually started in late 2013. It was mostly a cell of university students who were protesting President Yanukovych's about face when he decided to renege on the promise to pursue association agreement with the European Union and instead enter into the Eurasian Alliance Putin and Russia had organized as part of this larger kind of geopolitical attempt to reconfigure the power axes in the East. And just a quick side note, I was just recently reading, I think, again, Professor Plochy writes interestingly about this, believing that Putin miscalculated, forgetting that Beijing is stronger than Moscow and within this axis, which would be a really interesting point of political conversation, I think. The Maidan Revolution of Dignity is important because it escalated from a protest when Yanukovych used the Berkut riot police to respond violently on the university students. Their parents and grandparents went to Independence Square, among whom were veterans of the war in Afghanistan. And you have a multiplicity of languages being spoken, people of different religious persuasions on Maidan Square protesting Yanukovych. And Yanukovych continues to use the Berkut riot police. There's a standoff, and at one point, 100 people are killed. And a number of other people are wounded, and they convert St. Michael's Monastery, which is in that general vicinity, walkable by about 15 minutes, if I recall, into a hospital where people can take refuge without fear of reprisal. And the Revolution of Dignity becomes important politically for a whole number of reasons. And actually, Tal, your question, I think, kind of brings this whole issue of the West hand in glove with the Maidan. And the reason for it is this: at first, the Ukrainians succeed in ousting Yanukovych, but of course, the Russians respond first by immediately annexing Crimea, and eventually by supporting the separatists in Donbass, which leads to this civil war. Ask any Ukrainian, when did the war start? They won't say February 24, 2022. They will say it started in 2014, first with the annexation of Crimea, and then with the aiding of the separatists in Donbass. And Ukrainians will also say that part of their objective is to regain Crimea, which most other political commentators feel is off the table. I think that in the eyes, there are a couple of things that are important here. First, that the organizers of the Maidan began to dream about a Ukraine that would write a new meta-narrative, establish a new Ukraine. This by no means represented all of Ukraine or even majority of Ukrainians, but a number of intellectuals joined the movement, and they didn't want to draw upon some kind of a past, like, Cossack Baroque past of Ukraine, or even the first Ukraine where Mikhailo Hrushevsky, the great historian, is named the honorary president of the Central Rada. They want to establish a new Ukraine that where the people are working together to start fresh, not based on the Soviet past, not based on the Russian imperial past, not based upon Ukrainian grievances against Poland, even though relations between the countries had been on and off, more or less good. So in Russia, especially in the age of social media, this was viewed as a betrayal. This turn away from Russia was viewed as a betrayal. There is a good historian, his name is Mikhail Suslov, who has written extensively on this topic. He chronicled how Russian Orthodox clergy depicted the Maidan and essentially demonized the Ukrainians who were on the Maidan as traitors. And that the Maidan was a turning point both for a decisive Ukrainian turn away from Russia and its attempt to reconfigure the geopolitical axis, and toward Europe, basically to say that we want to be a part of Europe. We want to have the economic opportunities that come with belonging to the European Union. And what you see is that the political turn away challenged the churches to basically say, where do we stand? Are we with this turn to Europe? Are we with this turn to openness? Or are we going to remain, with the status quo? There's good literature on this as well. And so the Maidan Revolution of Dignity was both a turning point in terms of turning toward Europe, decisively turning away from subordination to Russia in any way, shape, or form, however one views that. And also, many Russians, especially political and religious elites, viewing Ukrainians who supported the Maidan as traitors, as an act of betrayal, which justified the annexation of Crimea, which is, symbolic for a number of reasons, among which is it's the baptismal site of Saint Volodymyr or Saint Vladimir, who is considered to be the patron of all Orthodox and Greek Catholics, Russia, Ukraine, Belarus. In terms of the whole Western issue, this is a much larger topic that brings us into Occidentalism. And I would probably go on for 45 minutes to really go on about that, because that's not a specifically Russian issue. I mean, we can talk about the Russian point of view on Russian Occidentalism, but there are other Eastern Orthodox thinkers who also view the West rather dubiously and in a derogatory fashion. So I would be hesitant to say that it's a strictly, and I have students in one of the classes that I teach read Serbian thinkers, Greek thinkers who not in the same way view this, have this negative view of the West. Here, for those of you who like to read, I would recommend the new book by Paul Robinson, Russian Conservatism, where he kind of chronicles Russian conservative thinking and how that evolved from the imperial age to the current time. But there's, and we had a discussion on this at a couple of different conferences that I've gone to. There's this notion that you can find in Russian thinkers in the late imperial period that has found new life today, that Russia has a messianic destiny to save the West from itself. It's not only to defend Russia from Western incursion and to defend Ukraine from being polluted by Western ideas, especially the ideas of the European Union, but to save the West from itself. The best known of these thinkers, whose name has, enters the mainstream media, is Alexander Dugin. And there's an interesting quote in this book by Robinson where he chronicles this whole thing, where Dugin basically says, I'm pro-West. I love the West, but I'm part of the West that is conservative, that is Christian. And I want to see that part of the West restored and revived and renewed and celebrated and beloved. And so there's a cohort of Russians who they don't have the same view on this topic. And it's not only Russians. And I'm not trying to just pick on Russian thinkers here. You can find this kind of train of thought in a lot of different places that either want to protect Russia from polluted Western values that they see symbolized in the laws and the ideals of the European Union, but also view Russia as having a destiny to both save the West from itself. And when you take it to its most extreme point of view, there's this word that appears in one of Paul's letters, the second letter to the Thessalonians, a katakon. It is to use all means necessary to save Christianity. And so there are some Russian thinkers who believe that Russia's destiny is to be a defender of Christianity at large, symbolized by the West. And so Ukraine became the focal point. It became the contested space with the Maidan Revolution of Dignity when it turned to Europe, where all of these ideas essentially gradually and tragically became violent.
Okay, this is my final question, and then we'll just open it up. But your book is not just about Russia and Ukraine; it's also about the fracturing of global orthodoxy over this issue. Maybe could you just say? I know you could talk about this quite at length. Maybe just what's at stake in the issue of the fracturing of the Orthodox Church, and then if I'm gonna sandwich two questions together here, I suppose. In the media, sometimes the conflict is presented very much as Russia, bad, 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 Ukraine, good, good, good. But you have some critical things to say about the Ukrainian side vis-a-vis religious policy. So I'll let you handle those how you want to, and then we'll open the floor up.
Thank you, Tal. The fracturing in orthodoxy, I think, actually predates the situation in Ukraine. There were the conflict within orthodoxy began in the early 20th century, really with the revolution, with other contested spaces, places like Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, Finland, Poland are good examples, places that had been at least under the influence, if not under the control of the Russian Empire, which then the ecumenical patriarchate of Constantinople laid claim to. And so those, and of course, when the Moscow Patriarchate, the Russian Orthodox Church, came under severe Bolshevik repression, that complicated it because they did not have the freedom as of 1927. They simply didn't have the freedom to be able to represent themselves as fully as one would hope in the global sphere of orthodoxy. And so there's been a simmering tension between the ecumenical patriarchate of Constantinople and the Russian Orthodox Church since the early 1920s. And a lot of the other Orthodox have just tried to stay out of it. I was talking to a bishop about this at a conference in Romania. And I remember him saying, well, our position is as follows. There are two elephants that are about to have a fight, and we're the mouse. So let's not get stepped on by either elephant. We don't want the ecumenical patriarchate to step on us or the Moscow patriarchate. So we're going to try to kind of find the middle ground. And a lot of the churches have done so successfully, but I think that they're finding it increasingly difficult because of the pressure that the Russian Orthodox Church is placing on all of the other churches with the creation of the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, where, for example, the best example is Africa. The Alexandrian Patriarchate was one of the patriarchates that recognized the new church. And when they did that, the Russian Orthodox Church said, hey, we'll be happy to take under our wing any parishes in Africa that disagree with the decision of their senior bishop. And they sent their own bishop to Africa to oversee these parishes that, for one reason or another, I don't really want to get into the reasons, maybe we can talk about that later, decided to go from the Alexandrian Patriarchate to Moscow. And this creates really terrible problems at the local level when you have someone from another country coming in and saying, this church is now ours. This church belongs to us. We're going to appoint our own priest. If you want to have a priest who's going to be here, you're going to have to go somewhere else. That's not the only issue. I mean, I know that a number of the other Orthodox churches just wish that this problem would go away by kind of calling for a ceasefire in the religious sphere, which has not happened yet, and there's no sign of it happening. One thing that would help a lot is if the Orthodox Ukrainians would set their differences aside. That would help a lot because that would turn the tide in a specific direction. But by my estimation, unless something has happened in the last half hour or so that we've been talking about this, which is quite possible, given the nature of the news, something has changed. I doubt it. The second issue, remind me what the second question was. Oh, yes. Well, I think that the big issue is that the Ukrainian Orthodox Church that was subordinate to Moscow has been under fire in Ukraine essentially since 1992. And there have been they have political supporters. They have members of the Ukrainian parliament that support them. They've had presidents that have supported them. But they've been under fire really since this whole Maidan revolution of dignity, but especially since the Russian invasion. A few days after the Russian invasion, their leader, Metropolitan Unholy, condemned Russian aggression, condemned the invasion, and expressed the church's support for the Ukrainian political structures, the people, the armed forces, their national sovereignty, and their territorial integrity. And they've been consistent in doing that. The problem really, I think, came to a head when within Ukrainian religious discourse, and the government has a special department or a bureau, if you will, that's devoted to ethnic and cultural affairs that includes religious affairs. And there has long been a discussion of exposing and prosecuting collaborators, people whom they believe the Russian Federation has either bribed or appointed to sabotage Ukrainian defense. And certainly in the mainstream media, there's been coverage of priests who have been prosecuted for giving intelligence to the Russian armed forces during the course of the war. How widespread this is, I cannot speak to that. There are certainly experts who know more about that, probably anecdotally and certainly on the ground than I do. I think the problem, though, is as follows. This church, they had a council in May of 2022 where they signaled that they were no longer had an affiliation with the Russian Orthodox Church. Now, there are a number of observers who believe that that was authentic and honest, and there are some who believe that it wasn't enough. And the problem is that some of the politicians in Ukraine don't believe it and believe that there are collaborators in parishes and in monasteries and in the ranks of the bishops. And essentially, the problem as I see it is that there are a number of different ways that the government could try to identify and expose and prosecute collaborators for treason. One of the ways that they decided to do it was to evict the Ukrainian Orthodox Church from the most beloved shrine in Ukraine. It's the Kiev Pechersk Lavra Monastery. And they announced this decision first to, I'm getting into some detail here, so you can cut me off if you want to, but the first it was because they said, well, we need to inspect the grounds because they've illegally, added things here. Like if you built a room in an apartment that you were renting, they were there rent free, and then it was a full blown eviction. Like their largest seminary is in that space. And the United Nations got involved because there was an appeal made to the United Nations, and they warned the Ukrainian government that they had gone too far, that they were infringing upon the rights and were violating the religious freedom of parishes in Ukraine that belonged to this church that was once subordinate to Moscow and is kind of in this gray space now in terms of to whom their allegiance lies, and basically warned them that they had been flagged, that they were violating their religious freedoms and permitting persecution and intimidation of some of their priests and some of their bishops. And the point that I would like to make that I think is problematic, this is a church of 12,000 parishes and millions of people. They have admitted that they have collaborators. They've admitted it. Their leaders have publicly admitted that there are collaborators among their ranks. Have they cooperated with the governmental authorities? That's questionable. Is the entire church a collaborator, all of it? No. And so that's where I think one has to be honest and trying to keep up with the news. And certainly, we have to say that it's war. We know of human rights violations. They're egregious, the human rights violations that the Russian Federation has committed in Ukraine. They're egregious. There is no justification for them. And so it's understandable that the president of Ukraine has a responsibility to defend his citizens, of course. To me, that goes without saying. So I'm not saying it's an easy job sitting here from this very comfy chair. But I am saying that I think it's a warning sign for what some people say is the most religiously pluralistic country in Europe, Ukraine, that they have gone to this lengths to try to flush out and expose collaborators among their ranks. I think it's a flag that anyone who is observing this situation must continue to pay attention to.
Okay, we at least have a little time, so I'll questions of others, and I'll let you just fill them as you see fit.
I'm going to toggle back and forth. I don't know if there, I'll probably go to the computer and see if there are any questions among participants on Zoom. So I'll just take the microphone, and I see one question there. We'll start there. Yes. Yeah, that's a wonderful comparison. I think that just to kind of explain the Russian situation, and there are others who are a little bit more knowledgeable on this than I am, certainly. Russian Orthodoxy in the immediate post-Soviet period enjoyed a quick revival, but there has been a plateauing and a steady decline since the immediate revival in the early 1990s. Certainly, there are millions of faithful adherents in Russia, but I think that the larger issue, and I meant to address this in the question that you raised before, is how does the church relate to the state? Really, in countries where the Orthodox Church is the majority throughout the world, there has been Orthodox churches have had a hard time figuring out how they're going to relate to the new governments. It's been very difficult for them. And in the post-Soviet period, it's been difficult for the Russian Orthodox Church. Now, there are others, I think, who could probably answer this question with greater accuracy, but to my knowledge, essentially, among faithful in Russian Orthodoxy, they were disappointed in the lack of vision, missionary impulse, evangelism in the patriarch, the leader of the Russian Orthodox Church, Alexei II, who was patriarch for the immediate part of the post-Soviet period, 1990, or was it 91? I think it was 1990 to 2008 until he died. There was a lot of confidence in the new patriarch Kirill because he was very well educated. He spoke many languages. He had vast experience in living abroad, in overseeing church life abroad, in ecumenical and interreligious dialogue. Still does. And there was a real hope. But what happened was that as soon as President Putin faced a challenge at home, it was around 2011, 2012, the Russian Orthodox Church became useful to him. And so there was a new relationship struck between the church and the state to kind of co-opt this idea of a Russian world, which doesn't belong exclusively to the church, but make it part of the ideological apparatus that the Russian government has in its geopolitical objectives. It's not the only idea that they have, but it's one of many. But see, that coexists at the same time with a really kind of a lukewarm participation in church life among Russian Orthodox faithful. Most people don't go to church regularly. I don't remember the exact numbers, but I think it was like 4 or 5% go every Sunday. And I don't mean to insult. That's Christianity is in decline worldwide. You know, the numbers are declining across the board. They're declining in Ukraine, not quite at the same rate, but they're declining there as well. There is resistance in certain places to the privileges that the Russian government gives to the Russian Orthodox Church when, like, if you need to build a road, or if you need a hospital, or you need a school and they're building a church instead, there's some resistance among the locals. And so I think in this case, the Russian Orthodox Church is useful, and part of what Russian reformers would like to see is a new negotiation of how the church is going to relate to the state, which is very difficult when you're dealing with such autocratic regime like one is in Russia, where the church is essentially tied to the state, at least at this point, and you've had a process of purification where so many intellectuals have been forced to move abroad, the kind of people who would seek reform and aren't on board with the Russian ideology. What I want to say, you didn't ask this question, but there was criticism leveled against the Ukrainian government for trying to create a state church, because the previous president, Poroshenko, was part of the process and really the political driving force in creating the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. There were a number of Orthodox observers and non-Orthodox observers who were very alarmed at the degree to which the government was favoring the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. And again, an officially religiously pluralistic country, one which has a vibrant resurgence of Judaism in the post-Soviet period. Alongside, and also one that welcomed Crimean Tatars, Muslim Crimean Tatars who were forced out of their homeland after the annexation. So to give that much favor to the new Orthodox Church of Ukraine was something that was looked quite disfavorably upon. And and what's interesting is that when Zelensky became president, he ran on the platform of not getting involved at all. But now he's being accused of the exact same thing, of cozying up too much to the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. Will it become a state church? I really highly doubt it. And if it did, it would be a problem that would only raise more, I think, for majority Orthodox populations in the world, of the church still not learning how to relate to the state. And there could be exceptions to this rule, but there is always a sort of magnetism of trying to find what is our place. You had that in Catholic Poland for a long time. And maybe that's still a problem. I'm not an expert in Catholic Poland, but that was an issue in Catholic Poland for a long time as well. So in Russia, the one difference that I would identify is that actual participation in church life is ebbing at a very low level. And so this is more at the level of official mechanisms. One of the jokes that circulated, and I don't know if this is true or not, is that sometimes when the Russian media posts photos of President Putin participating in Russian Orthodox holidays, that they're actually photoshopping him in because he's not the most observant Orthodox Christian. I don't know if that's true or not, but. Oh, thank you, Mandy. That's a fascinating question. I think that the question of what it means to be, I would even say, a Byzantine Rite Christian in Ukraine, to include the Greek Catholics in this, and this larger conversation, it is a process of evolution. You have and it's kind of alongside, well, what does it mean to be Orthodox? What does it mean to be Greek Catholic? We had a presentation on campus in the spring when Tal brought in the provost from the University of Notre Dame in his book on the Catholic Church and modernity, where we were wrestling with this question of how does one respond to changes that are so rapidly introduced into society, and the church is still trying to figure out, wait, which government is in control, and what are these government policies? And, we were standing with workers and now we're not. And, how all of that plays out. The church has a very hard time responding to the speed of these forces. In Ukraine, this is kind of how I see how it's looking. And I don't know how it's going to turn out. I'm hoping to be part of a larger project of people that works constructively on what it might look like to be Orthodox in Ukraine over the next several years. Because I think that what the original thought was is that there's a blueprint. And the blueprint is that you're a traditional Orthodox church, whatever that is, in a nation state instead of under an imperial apparatus. So Greece kind of set the tone, I think, for this when they established their first independent Orthodox church, because they were trying to follow their new national story, but they were trying to figure out, well, how does the Byzantine imperial legacy fit into all of this? And so they reached a compromise in Greece. You have exactly what you just said, competing allegiances. The vast majority of Greek Christians belong to the Orthodox Church of Greece, but a small minority belongs to the Patriarchate of Constantinople. And traditionalism is expressed in identity markers like language. When the Archbishop of Athens attempted to introduce modern Greek to be read alongside older Greek, speaking to a Greek scholar, of course, to the liturgy in 2004, the people in the cathedral in Athens protested and said, we don't want modern Greek, we want traditional Greek. And you have this phenomenon playing out in Serbia, in Bulgaria, to lesser degrees, certainly in Russia. Don't introduce modern Russian, use Church Slavonic, which nobody understands completely unless you've studied that language. And so competing allegiances are expressed alongside these identity markers. The model, the blueprint of being a traditional church in the modern nation state no longer applies. In all honesty, what Ukrainian intellectuals are talking about now is what will orthodoxy look like in a post-Putin state, in a post-Putin Ukraine. And I don't know if anyone knows. What the Orthodox Church of Ukraine is trying to claim is that they're going to draw upon their Greek roots and be part of the Greek orbit. So they had already embraced Ukrainization. And they recently said, well, we're going to celebrate Christmas on December 25th, because that's when the Ukrainian people want to celebrate Christmas, which would be a decisive step away from traditionalist orthodoxy. And then they decided, we're going to just embrace the whole new calendar. And we're going to go along the step that all of the other more, and I'm inventing this word, okay? It's not a technical term, but progressive Orthodox. The step that they would take, we're gonna celebrate the new Julian calendar. Small step for many of us, but a big step for Ukrainians. And what's really interesting about it is when they initially conceived of it, they said, well, we're going to do this because the Ukrainian people want it. Then after the war, when they actually adopted the decision, they said, this is a decisive step away from Russian aggression. Apples and oranges. So now it's being politicized. One of the threads of political theology is solidarity with the suffering Ukrainian people. That has been expressed certainly by the Greek Catholic Church consistently, and it is now being expressed in the homilies that are coming from the official Kievan pulpit of Metropolitan Epiphany of the Orthodox Church in Ukraine, of solidarity with the suffering Ukrainian people. And the question that I ask is, well, will Orthodoxy in Ukraine simply be a war memorial? hopefully when the war ends, one might say if it ends, it will eventually end. But when it ends, will it simply be a war memorial? And one of the things we didn't talk about, and hopefully it'll be a conversation topic that will come up again at some point, is the memorial in Russia, where you have an actual cathedral dedicated to the armed forces that essentially has sacralized the Victory Day, the Great Patriotic War of World War II, which fits into this whole Western theme. And what I think you see happening in Ukraine is that even though many Ukrainian citizens have family members who fought in that war and would normally participate in it, that they've taken a turn away from it because of what the Russian Orthodox Church has done in essentially becoming a militarized church and being part of the military apparatus and making and here I'm looking at you, Professor Griffin, because you're the one who's working on this now, making Victory Day into a very important holiday, even though it has nothing to do with events in the life of Christ or Mary. So in Ukraine, it's going to be interesting to see, what does solidarity with the people mean? What does it mean to suffer with them? I think it's a process that's very much in motion and could go in a number of different directions. The Orthodox in Ukraine right now are taking a kind of a cautious course and basically saying, well, we're going to follow the Greek line. We're going to follow the lead of the ecumenical patriarchate. And I would describe that as one of openness to dialogue with the world, an openness to dialogue with people of other faiths and religious traditions. Whereas in the Russian Orthodox Church, there's not a total rejection of that kind of openness. They meet with people of other religions all the time, but you have a more vocal conservative strand that's all orthodoxy all the time or only orthodoxy. And it's, to me, your question is kind of hits at the crux of the crisis in orthodoxy, because it really is the great question of, well, here we are, it's the 21st century. Who are we? What kind of a church are we going to be? And the answers seem to be all over the map. And many of them are deeply anchored in political ideologies and imperial ideologies of the past.
We are already at 5:30, so this is a very rich conversation. I know my students out there are working on a paper, so I know you might have other things to do. So let me, what I was going to suggest is if you need to leave, we're going to thank Nick now, but if you still have a question, why don't you just come up and continue the conversation a little bit. But let's give him a round of applause for this achievement. So, and thank you for coming.